Hello and welcome to Impact Club. May peace be upon you. I'm your host Sabah Fatima. Our guest today is Sumayyah Taufique. She received her master's in social work from the University of Maryland School of Social Work. As a former teacher and now therapist, Sumayyah believes and honors an individual's ability to learn and grow. She incorporates this belief in her therapy and uses a strength-based model that emphasizes looking at clients holistically and guides them through the journey of building a more meaningful self. Sumayyah works with adolescents and adults to address anxiety, depression, life transitions, identity issues, parenting challenges, spirituality, and adjustment disorders using a diverse set of evidence-based clinical tools. She works to understand her clients, their cultural context, their beliefs and lifestyle, and then caters her methods to best meet their individual needs. Sumayyah is passionate about providing an accessible, culturally responsive, and therapeutic environment where safety, compassion, and acceptance are integral pillars of the process. She is currently working as a supervisee in social work, gaining postgraduate hours required for state licensure. Sumayyah, how are you today?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm great too. I'm so honored and grateful that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Sumayyah, what inspired you to become a mental health counselor and a therapist?
So a couple of things are probably why I'm a therapist today. I grew up knowing that there were things I wanted to talk about and I had nowhere to go to talk about them. I remember having that feeling in middle school, in high school. High school was the first time I took a psychology class. I took AP Psych, and I remember just being so fascinated and being like, oh my gosh, so much of this is so significant in helping me understand myself and making sense of the world around me. Mm-hmm. And so that was probably my first inclination that this is where I was headed. I did undergrad in psych and English. And then I ended up being a teacher for 4 years, and I was a teacher at a local Islamic school. And that is where I realized, like, this is what I have to do, because teachers are amazing and teachers wear so many hats, right? Teachers are teachers, and they're also your therapist, and they're also sometimes your mom and sometimes your nurse. So they're just everything. And I found myself really enjoying the part of talking to my students and creating spaces for them to like gain understanding and being able to express themselves. And so that led to finally applying to grad school. And that's how I am here today.
And I guess there is the transition between teacher and therapist it's almost equivalent to transitioning from like being a doctor and then pursuing something higher, like a master's. Because as a teacher, you're playing all of you are constantly playing all of these roles, and being a therapist is like a new hat that you wear, but it's a big hat and it's a big responsibility.
It absolutely is. I will say though, being a teacher was the hardest thing I ever did. Like I have so much respect for teachers because wow, it is a lot to be a teacher. And so for me, being a therapist is almost an extension of that. Like I did play like a therapist role in the classroom, but now it was taking one element of what I did as a teacher and really like specializing in it and like leaning into it. It's definitely a lot of responsibility that comes with a lot of meaningful experiences and a lot of joy. I find a lot of meaning and fulfillment in the work that I do.
That is awesome. And Sumayyah, how do we handle the stigma attached to seeking help in our communities, especially when it comes to mental health?
So what I will say is I think the stigma is evolving a lot. I think especially when you talk to millennials or Gen Z, right? Like these generations are growing up with a very, very different conversation around mental health, which is really exciting to see, because I don't think we could have said the same thing 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So I do think the stigma is evolving, and we're really lifting like the shame around this idea of seeking help. I do think there's still room for us to grow into it a little bit more. And that I think comes from the kind of conversations that are happening in our homes and our communities that really highlight emotional wellness as an essential part of our being. And so I think the more we have those conversations, the more we understand that emotional wellness is as significant as physical wellness or spiritual wellness, the stigma is going to decrease, as it already has.
That is so optimistic, and it's a sigh of relief too, because I guess there is a there is, as you said, it is on a decline, but we can still do better. And there is,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I believe so. I think I'm optimistic because I really ground myself in the belief that we are capable of change. And
Mhm,
as we evolve as individuals, right, as each of us do our own emotional work, we're going to
mhm,
bring that energy and that understanding into our roles as community members, as parents, as siblings, as like children to our parents, right? Like, so I feel a lot of hope only because I see so many people doing that work on an individual level.
mhm.
And when we change at an individual level, I truly believe that we are also changing at a community level. And
Yes.
so while I know the stigma can be harsh, and I know a lot of people are still kind of swimming through it and our communities are still navigating it,
Mhm.
um, I'm very hopeful that the conversations that kids like our kids will have, or kids in
Mhm.
like 5, 10 years will look very different than the conversations maybe we had in elementary school or middle school,
Yep.
because I think more of us are doing the work, which is just really exciting and inspiring.
Yes, and I think that is driving awareness and conversations, and that is uh, like a big thing for change when we have conversations about these things, and that, as you said, starts from individuals and homes, and then it just propagates
Yeah,
into.
I
So.
agree. And that's the reason why I can be hopeful, is because I see so many, I predominantly work with Muslim women. I see
Mhm.
so many women doing that work. And to me, there is no way that that doesn't change the experience of the
Yep.
next generation. Or even if we don't talk about the next generation, it doesn't change the experience of the friends in the same circles as those women, or the communities that these women are involved
Mhm.
in, or it just goes everywhere.
Yeah. And so, Maya, you work with Muslim women, as you said, to help build their mental wellness and emotional well-being. How important is it to cater to one's unique needs, like during diagnosis and treatment?
So yes, I do work with Muslim women, and I'm really, really passionate about centering emotional and mental wellness. In terms of catering to one unique's needs during diagnosis and treatment, so I would maybe add some more things to that. I don't only
Mm-hmm.
work with people who have a diagnosis, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
therapy is important whether or not you have a diagnosis,
Yep.
because therapy is really the journey of you understanding yourself and building a meaningful relationship with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So therapy work in and of itself is about like centering you specifically. And so your
Mm-hmm.
journey is going to look different, and your experiences are going to look different, and what they mean to you is going to look different. And so well-being, when we truly do it in a meaningful way,
Mm-hmm.
is a grounding of you in yourself. Like, you have to be grounded and taking care of yourself so that you can play a role in the well-being of everything else that you do, right? Whether that's
Mm.
community work or siblings or family or whatever your roles are. But if you aren't doing the work of taking care of you, it becomes really challenging to do all of the other meaningful work that you want to do in your life.
That is so truthful and powerful, because it starts with us being healthy ourselves, both mentally and physically, to even start helping our surroundings, helping others, making a difference. So
Yeah.
being well is so, like, a lot of times underrated, because usually we expect everyone to show up and get the job done.
Yeah, we're so used to powering through things, right? Like,
Mm,
and again, I'll speak to the experiences of like women more like specifically only
yeah.
because I work with women.
Mhm.
And I do think there's some underlying cultural values around just powering through
Mm,
and serving others before yourself. And while I think women are able to do that, I think it just leads us down roads of
mm,
a lot of unwellness and unhappiness. And we pay a really
yeah.
high price with our emotional health and our physical health when we do that. And
Yep.
so finding balance in, I need to fuel myself to be
Mhm.
able to fuel and to be able to do all the things I need to do around me. is really essential, whether or not you go to therapy or, have a diagnosis, or it's just a basic element of wellness, right? Like you need to fill your bucket of
Yeah.
like emotional health and physical health.
And you bring up an important point, especially in regards with women, of how there is maybe a subconscious expectation or cultural expectation from society in general to have to fill all of these multiple roles and responsibilities, and that is sometimes as something that is expected and not seen as something that needs to be valued, and that is something that is really hard to do.
Yeah.
And and for anyone to be able to keep it together, essentially, juggling all of that, it's so hard. And I guess there shouldn't be an expectation like that in the first place.
It's a lot to carry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things start to eventually feel really, really heavy when you are carrying way beyond your capacity.
True.
And so this is where, with a lot of gentleness and curiosity, I think women need to start asking themselves, right? Like, what am I investing within me to be able to do all of the things that I do? What is on my plate that doesn't need to be on my plate? Maybe was just plopped onto your plate because of whatever reason, right? And so recognizing that we are allowed to assess our well-being and reassess the roles that we play and adjust them as we grow and evolve and start to recognize our own needs.
And knowing that it is totally okay to do that, and it's encouraged to take care of yourself. So
it's more than okay, right? It is the healthy thing to do. It is the it's just, it's not even like, oh, women need permission. It's almost like we need to celebrate when women shift that dynamic of I matter too, right? Like, yes, everyone else matters and the things that we care about in the world matter, but I matter. And so when women start to hold that along with, recognizing that other people matter, or their work matters, or their family matters, we completely change the dynamic for ourselves.
That is absolutely true. And Sumayyah, in the time of this pandemic, depression and anxiety have been prevalent due to a lot of reasons. What advice would you like to give to those who are feeling down, burnt out, stressed, or overwhelmed from time to time?
This pandemic, it has been a journey. So in terms of depression, anxiety, one, I really want to normalize it in the sense that it's okay that you're feeling those things, right? It makes sense. Our lives have changed so dramatically, and the things that maybe we normally relied on to take care of ourselves, right? Whether that was being our social life or being able to travel or go out, the things that were really fulfilling and rejuvenating for us stopped happening. You just couldn't access those things for a very long time. And so really recognizing that our depression and our anxiety makes sense. And I want people, and I say this to my clients all the time, I try to do it with myself all the time, like get really curious with yourself. Curiosity is like our superpower that I don't think we use enough. And so turning inward, like, wow, I'm feeling really burnt out. I want you to get really curious about that burnout. Scale it on a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the most burnout you've ever been. Where are you at right now? Right. And maybe some people are at a 10, or they notice like, okay, maybe I'm closer to like a 5 or a 6. And then we stay curious. Okay, if I'm burnt out or anxious at a 5 or a 6, what do I need to take care of myself? Right? Like, what helped me in the past? Is there something that I can use today that can slowly help me navigate these emotional experiences? And so I want people to get curious with themselves. Ask yourself some hard questions of, what do I need to do differently? What do I need to add? What do I need to take away to help me navigate some of these emotional experiences? The other thing I'll add is there's some like basic foundational things that need, like I consider like almost the pillars of well-being, which is food, sleep, movement, and connection, right? Oftentimes, like we separate out our emotional experiences from like our physical experiences. And so we're struggling with anxiety, but we're also not eating enough, or we're drinking coffee on an empty stomach and revving up our system without supporting it with any like nutrients or any calories. We're also not paying attention to our sleep. So we're sleeping a lot less, or we're waking up really early, or, we're just not noticing that the absence of those things is going to have some emotional impact. So if we're already struggling with anxiety and I'm not eating enough and I'm not sleeping enough, those symptoms are going to get more intense.
Yeah.
And so foundationally, check in on your meals. How often are you eating? Are you eating enough to sustain your body? And I say this a lot to women because we have weird messaging around food, but you need to make sure you're eating. Sleep is so essential. Like, I cannot emphasize enough how much sleep impacts emotional well-being. And if you're not sleeping enough, it becomes a lot harder to manage any like low mood or any high anxiety, right? Because basic essential ingredients for your body to do well are not happening. Movement. And I know every time I say movement, people think I'm talking about working out. I don't care if you work out or not. Literally, do not care if you're going to go work out or not. But our body needs some just like some kind of physical movement to like stretch our muscles and move emotional energy out. Right. So a lot of times emotional energy gets stored in our bodies. If you notice, some people will have anxiety symptoms that they feel in their stomach, or like depression or overwhelm that's really heavy on their shoulders. Like we have physical symptoms connected to our emotional experiences. And so it's really important that we incorporate something for our bodies as part of our emotional well-being. So go for a walk, do some stretching, do a dance party. Like, I don't know what feels good to you, but do something that is moving your body. And then the last one is meaningful connection. Human beings are designed for connection. That is how Allah has made us. That is part of one of our essential needs. And I know COVID and the pandemic have really isolated us.
Yeah.
And so starting to think about, are there spaces or people that I go to or that I connect with that when I leave, I feel really full? And I don't know if you know what I mean by that. You know how sometimes you go to like parties and you walk out and you're so exhausted because you're just like talk too much. You're like, man, that was really exhausting. Or sometimes you come out of like social gatherings and you're like, wow, even though I'm tired, I feel really good. I'm so glad I connected, right? Like it's a different kind of like emotional full.
Yes.
That is what I want people to think about. Where do you find those? Because we have a need for connection. And if these foundational elements aren't being met to whatever degree we're capable of, emotional regulation just becomes a lot harder.
Yeah.
So I just threw a lot at you. So
yes. And I'm like, every point that you mentioned is so important. And I feel like that is where a lot of people don't make that connection between their mental health and their physical health. How knowing that it is connected, because usually when I feel stressed or burnt out, the first thing I do is start neglecting my physical health. I don't care about food anymore. I'm like, oh, I decide to stay up at night. You know what I mean? It's like if I have to consciously decide that, okay, as you said, if I need to become curious about what is happening first, and think about, okay, what is going to help me instead of what I can do to escape it. And you mean, so if I am turning towards escaping, I might overindulge in food or not eat food, or I might like decide to lose sleep over scrolling on my phone. So it is, what you said is so important. And I feel that is the key, essentially.
Yeah. And I also think that like, what you were describing, it's really important for us to get curious about the behaviors that we are actually doing when we feel these emotions. So say, for example, you're really stressed. And so you find yourself being on your phone more, right? You're just scrolling more. And I know that there's a lot of judgment around that. Like the way that people talk about it is like, you're avoiding and stop scrolling. And like, sometimes we're really harsh.
It is.
Again, I want to come back to like very gentle curiosity. What is scrolling on your phone trying to do for you? Like, why are you using this behavior? Because usually we use behaviors for a specific reason. So even though we label them as like maybe unhealthy coping, they're meeting some kind of need. And so it's really important that we get really curious. Like, okay, when I'm anxious, I find myself scrolling on my phone. What is scrolling on my phone doing for me? And maybe what we name it as is like, okay, it's giving me like a mental break. Okay, cool. If that's what scrolling on the phone is doing for you, can we just bring some intentionality to it? Being like, okay, I need a mental break. I'm going to scroll for 10 minutes. Versus the absence of intentionality to it. And then we just scroll for hours, not realizing what we're trying to do. And so if we bring intentionality to it, it's like, okay, I am scrolling because I need a mental break. One, we can get curious. Are there other things that could give you that same mental break that might serve you better? Right? Could going for a walk give you the same mental break as scrolling on your phone does? Could having a meaningful conversation with your friend give you the same break as scrolling does? So getting curious and also removing some judgment. Sometimes it's okay to scroll on our phone to get a break, right? Like it's okay if we use those. It just can't be the only thing that we use all the time without awareness.
Yes. And as you said, awareness is important here because as you said, taking a mental break with your phone or any activity that you know you're aware that brings you relaxation is fine as long as you know that you're not overindulging or you know you are not letting it affect you in a way that you are consumed by it. I guess a lot of times just having that curiosity, that awareness, as you mentioned, is I feel lacking in a lot in us, or being present to not like think about our surroundings, thinking about, okay, I need to do 1, 2, 3, these are my tasks for the day. Instead of that, if we just take a moment to look inwards to understand our own behaviors.
And that only happens if it makes such a difference. And it only happens if we stop judging ourselves for these things, right? Like, again, kind of coming back to women, there's a lot of judgment around emotional eating. Like, oh my gosh, I get stressed, so I go for sugar. And we get upset with ourselves and we judge ourselves for it instead of just being really gentle and curious with ourselves. It's like, okay, I'm noticing that when I'm sad, I tend to go to the pantry to like grab chocolate. What is chocolate doing for me? Right? And it could be chocolate provides comfort, or it feels, it energizes me so I don't feel as sad, or it does something for us. And if we can just stay gentle and curious with ourselves, we can understand our behaviors better. And then one, we can regulate them. And two, we can try other things. So if chocolate gives me comfort, I can ask myself, are there other ways that might be more helpful to me that can still provide me comfort? Right? Like, we can be very gentle and curious. And sometimes we can be like, actually, chocolate provides me some comfort and I'm okay with eating the piece of chocolate. Cool. Eat the chocolate. Right? Like, it's just becoming aware of why you're doing something and deciding if that is a behavior that still serves you. And if it does, awesome. Like, we need to take care of ourselves. And then if it doesn't, you can edit the behavior because we are all capable of making change.
It's almost like having this behavior. It's like impulse control. And you also mentioned meaningful connections, and I wanted to stress on that point because during the course of this pandemic we have I don't know if it was something that happened like a wave across homes and families or communities, but essentially there was a dip in us having those interactions and meaningful interactions, because we've all been we've been online, we've been working from our homes, but having those meaningful interactions that leave you fulfilled, that is like, I have had a dearth of it. Like, I couldn't find that a lot during this time.
I mean, I'm there with you, right? Like, the absence of like community and the absence of like being around people who you love or that you feel a lot of connection to has really, really impacted well-being.
Yes, it is true. And I guess it's like, as you said, being aware of that aspect as well and prioritizing that and bringing that back into our lives, it's going to make a difference.
And also recognizing that like this pandemic it's been almost 2 years, right? And so again, being really gentle with yourself and knowing that like it's been around for 2 years and it might take us a while to like emotionally recover from it. And that's
True.
okay, right? Emotionally recover from that burnout and from just the heightened anxiety that this experience brought, and continues to bring. The reality is that we're still in it, right? Like we're not on
There
the
are
other
like
side of
new
things.
variants that are always surprising us from time to time.
Exactly. And so again, like really validating your emotional experience and approaching yourself with a lot of gentleness to be like, okay, I'm going to do the best that I can to take care of myself. And it's also okay that I still feel anxious or that I still have low mood, because that's also part of this experience.
Yes. And gentleness is key here.
Yeah, gentleness, gentle curiosity is my favorite thing. And I think we all need to practice it a little bit more. And just to add a little bit of a caveat to this, I'm using depression and anxiety almost in like a non-clinical way. Like this doesn't mean you need to have like a diagnosis for depression or a diagnosis for anxiety. Like low mood and anxiousness are very like human experiences.
Yep.
And so that's kind of what I'm talking about when we're talking right now. If there is a clinical diagnosis, then I think obviously the care needs to be stepped up a bit, which is like therapy or medication and things like that. Like and usually the measure is how much is the low mood or the anxiousness impacting functioning. If you're noticing like you're really struggling to function, that's usually a pretty good sign to get professional help, like
to seek
step
help.
It up one more notch.
And I'm happy that you made that differentiation, because a lot of times when you want to reach out for help, and that is a sign in itself that it is time that you seek help.
I mean, I'm a fan of like everybody going to therapy. Like I tell the whole world to go to therapy. And because I mean, I go to therapy, I'm a therapist, right? Like I'm a true believer in like having this space where you can process your feelings, whether or not you have a clinical diagnosis, whether or not things are significantly impacting functioning or whatever. Like I think having a safe space to process your experiences in your life is really important. And so like, I don't mind sharing my personal experience. I'm somebody who went to therapy. I still go to therapy. And at different points in my life, it was a lot more frequent. I was going every week. At other points in my life, it's been like once a month or as needed. Right. Yeah. And so life changes and evolves, and your emotional state changes and evolves, and having the space where you can talk through it and process and learn how to navigate it is super helpful.
Yes. And Sumayyah, moving on to something that I feel is not talked about that a lot, but I want to touch on this. So any form of mental or physical abuse can have serious effects on a person. What are some of the initial steps you think one can take towards healing?
Mental and physical abuse is challenging. It's a hard experience to have. I think one, just really starting off with abuse is not your fault, right? If you are on the receiving end of abuse, sometimes things get a little blurry, and as part of the abuse, it can also one of the weapons of abuse is to make you feel like you're deserving of it, like you did something and that is why I hit you, or you did something, and that like it's very centered around blaming the person who is being abused. And so I think recognizing that, and I know this is sometimes very hard to recognize, but if anyone's listening and is on the receiving end or has been, you are never to be blamed for abuse. Abuse is never an acceptable thing. And as you're thinking about steps towards healing, abuse is generally a really good like therapy is a really good tool when trying to navigate abuse, only because abuse, it's on a spectrum, right? Like there's so many forms of abuse and degrees of abuse. And so finding yourself a space to feel heard and validated, and a space where you can figure out how to navigate if there's trauma or navigate the emotional pain is going to be really, really essential. And so the abuse is not your fault, and you deserve to feel better, right? Like that is part of, I think someone's right is to find a space where they can feel like they have the space to heal. And so recognizing that you deserve to heal, you did not deserve this to happen to you, and then finding a space that feels really safe and comfortable for you to process.
Yep. And I know that this is going to be a long journey for anyone who has been through something like that, because a lot of times, there is always this thing where we want to, get better, and just like we expect it to happen overnight. So
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the journey to emotional wellness, I think it's the same journey as your physical health, right? We never have a point in our journey of physical health where it's like, okay, cool, my physical health is perfect, now I'm done paying attention to it, right? That's not a thing. You take care of your physical health every day. Your physical health is evolving based off of different time periods in your life, your age, your context of life. And sometimes something comes up and your blood work is all off and you're low on something, right? Like physical health is constantly evolving, and you are paying attention to it and you're meeting its needs. So I view emotional health in that same way, right? Like there's no end point of like, cool, I'm emotionally healthy right now, and now I don't have to do anything about it. That's not a thing. Emotional health is something that's with you for the rest of your life. And so it's a part of you that you're always taking care of. And so to me, things like obviously may Allah protect us all, but like if you had cancer or something, right? That's something really significant that happened to your body. The care for it is going to take a while. Then eventually, you kind of figure out like what you need to be paying attention to, and may Allah heal all of us. Like, right, you kind of, there's another side to this, and you evolve. In the same way, emotional health, we can have some really hard things happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes it requires some more intensive care. And then you kind of go on and like, yes, it's something that maybe will pop up again later on that you need to be paying attention to or taking care of. But it also doesn't have to be defining of your life.
Yeah. And especially with, people who've gone through mental or physical abuse of any kind of, or like varying degree, it's almost so brave or courageous or even emotional, and it requires a lot of energy even to start talking about it and processing it, and to take that journey and to go on that journey itself. So
it does. I think a part of that is believing that you're worth it, right? You are worth investing that time and energy in. We're on a journey in life, whether we want to be on it or not, right? Like life is happening.
Yeah.
And so why not take some of that movement and invest it in ourselves and invest it in our like well-being. And so I know that the first step can often feel the heaviest, right? That first, people are often like the most nervous about their first session of therapy. I remember my first session of therapy and I just sat on the couch and I just cried. And like, I was like, I don't know if this is normal, like what is happening? And so that first step into that room can feel really challenging, but it's worth, like, it's really deciding, am I worth investing this effort into and this time into? And I often find like, as a therapist, I often feel like one of my roles is to hold hope until my clients can embrace that hope that they can feel better. Like I can often see the other side of their journey where I'm like, okay, this is where they're at. And I can kind of see how dark the tunnel feels. And I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But a lot of times when we're starting, we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And one of my favorite parts as a therapist is when my clients are able to see that light and hold their own hope. And so it's almost feeling like when they get to a place where they're like, oh, I do feel better, or I can do things to make myself feel better, or my past doesn't feel like it's still in my present, right? Like once they feel like they've kind of shifted spaces, it's such a significant moment. And it's one of my favorites as a therapist, like to be like, oh, wow, you can feel hopeful now. And so I often, like I said, I feel like I carry hope until my clients are able to see it for themselves. And then they become the carriers of their own hope,
It
right?
is
They
so
see the light.
beautiful. I mean, it's so beautiful to just see someone, or just being part of that journey. It's almost like watching the bird fly out of the nest,
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so exciting. Like and I think that all of us are capable of that, right? Like I'm such a believer in like all of us have a journey that we need to go to for ourselves. And as I think as a therapist, I get a tiny glimpse of that journey and it's really
Mhm.
beautiful.
That is awesome, and I'm so glad that you're doing this, and may you reach heights of success and have more success stories on your plate, and may you help more journeys. I mean, inshallah, may Allah make it easy, may Allah protect you, and may Allah make beautiful journeys, make possible beautiful journeys for all of us.
I mean, absolutely. I think I appreciate all the du'as. I will take that.
And Sumayyah, I want to talk a little about this topic. So, unhealthy coping mechanism is one of the slippery slopes that we fall into, and it's so hard to sometimes break these vicious cycles. What advice would you like to give to those who are dealing with this issue?
So I know this sounds a little odd, but like I view what we label as unhealthy coping mechanisms a little differently. To me, we started that behavior because at some point in our lives, that behavior met the need that we were trying to achieve. So again, let's just take an example of like emotional eating. So at some point in your life, you learned that if you were feeling really bad, eating was going to help you feel better, right? Like that, somewhere along the way, your brain made that connection. And it often happens like when we're younger. So say, for example, like you're like a teenager and there's no one else for you to talk to, and you don't really know what's going on or why you feel the way that you do, and whatever, right? Like whatever your context is, you made the connection of like, oh, when I eat, I feel better. And so at some point, that coping mechanism was designed to serve you because it made you feel better. And that's what you were looking to do. It's when we grow and evolve and we realize, oh man, this method of coping is no longer serving me in the space that I'm at in my life now. And so then we get curious, okay, if this coping mechanism isn't serving me, we don't have to shame and judge ourselves for it. It served us at some point. Maybe we didn't have access to other ways of coping.
Yeah.
But maybe now we do. So for example, if we're a teenager and we don't have anyone to talk to, like we can't talk to our parents, we can't go to therapy, we're too ashamed to talk to our friends, we're going to look for a way to cope that is accessible. And so sometimes that's food, sometimes it's other things. But it served us at some point. And so when we look at it now, we're like, okay, I feel like maybe I have other resources that can meet the same need that this coping mechanism is meeting. And so we can adjust it. And granted, sometimes it takes a little bit more practice and it takes trying to adjust. But it's recognizing that that coping mechanism no longer serves you. You are capable of replacing it with something that does. So if you want to shift like food as your main coping mechanism, I don't believe it's bad to sometimes use food as coping. I don't think that that's like emotional eating to me isn't this big horrible thing. Sometimes we eat and it makes us feel better and it's fine. It just can't be our only coping mechanism. And to recognize like, how do I expand my toolbox of coping mechanisms? So one of them is eating. Okay, cool. We can leave that in the toolbox. What else can we add though? So when I'm feeling really sad or really alone, what else can I use that might help me? And this is where we want to increase your toolbox of like adding in maybe reading a book or coloring or talking to a friend or going for a walk or doing something that makes us feel really productive or whatever it is, right? Like, can we add more coping mechanisms to your toolbox so that that one coping mechanism that you want to change isn't the only one that you're relying on?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? But you can totally ask me more questions about it, but that's kind of how I view that.
That makes total sense. And I feel as you were mentioning that having that toolbox, it's like, I don't know if a lot of people think about it like a toolbox.
Yeah.
Because if I'm going to add, say, you mentioned food in the toolbox, I know there are other things that I can add that would not make me feel the way I feel after, I go on a binge,
Yeah,
and it's so important that we develop the toolbox and we start thinking about those ideas.
exactly. I love the visual of a toolbox because
Mm-hmm.
we're so used to like labeling things as good and bad. Like this coping mechanism is good and this coping mechanism is bad. And obviously there are some coping mechanisms that are just harmful, right?
Yeah.
That we do completely want to take out of the toolbox. We're like, this is
Mm-hmm.
harming you, so we don't
Yes.
want it in the box. But a lot of other ones, um, we just want to expand what we use.
Mm,
So we don't want Netflix, constantly watching Netflix, to be the only coping mechanism you have. It can
exactly.
be one of them, right?
Mm,
Like some evenings you can come home and like marathon a couple of episodes of whatever you're watching. And that doesn't have to be unhealthy. But if it's the only one you're using all the time, every single day, and you're not addressing what's leading you to constantly needing
mm,
to cope with Netflix, right? That's what we're trying to expand on. So, can
yeah.
we increase the number of coping skills in your toolbox? And then
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is are we addressing the thing that is causing you to need this much coping, right?
Yeah.
Like if there is like a significant source of stress in your life, do we need to actually address the source of the dysregulation
Mm,
rather than the coping mechanism you're using?
yeah. And I call it a vicious cycle sometimes because you know how you have a coping mechanism and how it makes you feel. There's a lot of guilt involved
Mhm.
with falling into, say, something that you didn't want to do.
Yeah.
And and then you have to pull yourself back. You need to push yourself to make sure that, okay, you recover from that, and you try to get back to being, essentially being normal again. And I have this thing where a lot of times, it's, as you said, it starts with the source, and you are, when you start that process of identifying the cause of the dysregulation, and you start that journey of a little bit of healing, and then developing a toolbox. And so it is almost like you take a step, and then you take a step, and even when you fall at some steps, say step number 3,
Mhm.
you can still start over again. And a lot of times people are, there's so much disheartening of, if when something does not work out, or there is
Yeah.
always this thing, oh, I'm such a loser.
Yeah,
And
there's a
just
lot of
beating yourself
judgment.
up. And
Yeah. So one thing I'll say, so I often tell my clients, like, I don't believe in normal. I think we're all on a spectrum of like abnormal. It just all looks different, right? Like if we keep trying to fit
totally
some narrative of
support that. I think none of us are normal.
there's no such thing as like, I feel like what is normal? Who defines normal? We're really
Mm,
thinking about like um what serves us the best in terms of taking care of ourselves. And so
mm,
that may look different for everyone. Um, the other thing is this idea of like, if I mess up on step 3, then I'm
mm,
back at square one. I don't actually believe that because to me, whether you like, and I'm you can't see I'm doing air quotes, but like whether you
mm,
mess up, like
mm,
say like you're trying to adjust your coping skills, right? So like for a week, you
mm,
only used emotional eating, or you didn't use any emotional eating, or you didn't like watch Netflix every single night. And then
mm,
like the second week you find yourself back at Netflix, right? Like, oh man,
yeah.
I'm back to
Mm,
5 hours on Netflix. To me, that isn't, you're not back at square one. I'm curious what happened that led you back to doing the Netflix coping, right? Just
mm,
again, because we know you're capable. You've already done it for a week or you haven't watched
yeah.
it. So what shifted, right? Like, are your expectations too high for yourself? Like maybe you do need some Netflix. Like it just needs to be more intentionally planned or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
like I often have concepts like, oh my gosh, like I'm back to square one. And I'm like, I don't know if we go back to square one once we've built some awareness, right?
Yeah.
Like once you know, you can't unknow those
Mm,
things. Once you've tried other like coping skills and they work, you're not going to unknow them. We're just going to get curious about, hey, what's getting in the way of you continuing to use them?
hmm. That
So,
is powerful. I mean, to not think or shift that mindset of being able to say, okay, I'm not. go back to square one. It's just that I missed a beat and
Yeah.
I can carry
And we
on.
do that all the time. Like, we are humans, right? Like, we are forgetful and flawed. And so, and our brains are designed for shortcuts. And so if our
Mhm.
brain has built a shortcut between I'm feeling really sad and like bumming on the couch,
Mhm.
it's going to default to that pathway very quickly
Yeah.
because that's the little pathway that's been built in your brain.
Mhm.
So adjusting that pathway, one takes a lot of practice. And
Yep.
so when we fall back into an old pathway, okay, cool. That happens. That's how our brains work. We're
Mhm.
human. We just like, okay, wait, I know that I'm building some other pathways in my brain between like, I'm feeling sad, so I'm going to go talk to someone, or,
Yeah.
like we're building some of those other pathways. And so we just try them again.
Yep. I think that is important, and thank you for the analogies. I mean,
No problem. I use a lot of them, and sometimes they totally don't work, and sometimes they do. But I just think that if we lift some of our judgment off of ourselves,
Mhm.
we would give ourselves so much more space to be really human. And in that humanness, we may find a lot of growth.
Yeah.
But because we're so harsh with ourselves of like, I should be like this, I shouldn't be doing this,
Mm.
why can't I'm so lazy, we're so busy labeling ourselves and
Mhm.
boxing ourselves in, that we are in some ways just hurting ourselves more,
Mhm.
right? With that should narrative of like, I need to, I have to, I should.
And that narrative that you mentioned, Samaya, I feel a little bit of that comes from I guess, the culture of comparing yourself, or
Yeah.
being
Uh-huh.
on this, being in a space where you are feeling bad about yourself because you are exposed to, say, someone's like, oh, lives are perfect, and then you have that judgment and that comparison
Yeah.
sometimes.
I mean,
It's
yes, that is the very challenging human experience of comparison, right? And sometimes, like, yes, we do it to ourselves, or sometimes that's a lot of the messaging that we get from around us, whether it is that you grew up being compared to like an older sibling or a cousin or a
Mm,
friend, right? Comparison is often used as a tool for motivation,
yeah.
right? Like, we're like, oh, well, if she can do it, I can do it. Or like,
Or
why didn't you get
somebody
the A?
scored, like, yeah, exactly.
Yep, exactly. And it was an attempt to motivate or
Mm,
something. And sometimes it gets internalized and then we try to use it on ourselves.
mm,
And comparison does not motivate. Comparison most of the time just shames us, right? And so we function
mhm,
off of like, oh my gosh, I feel so ashamed, so I'm just going to try to get this thing done, and then I feel ashamed again, and it just creates this really toxic cycle within us
mhm.
of feeling shame. And
Yeah.
so when I want to, it's also important to recognize that like it's normal to catch ourselves in comparison, but it's really
Mm,
important that we catch ourselves, right?
yeah.
And then be like, oh man, I'm getting stuck in comparison. Like, how do
Mhm,
I take care of myself? And so
yeah.
sometimes that requires like, affirming yourself of being like, listen, I'm good, I'm capable, I can do hard things. My life is allowed to look different. I'm allowed to have my own timeline, right? Sometimes, like, and these are things that literally I use on myself where I'm like, oh
Mhm.
man, comparison storm. Like, this is where I'm stuck. And I have to like very gently pull myself out and ground myself back in myself and in my own life. Because
And you said,
comparison
like,
literally pulls us out.
yes, and you said something, you said about recognizing it. And I feel like when you recognize it, maybe you can pull the plug from the trigger of whatever is causing that. It could be social
Yes.
media, it could be any, like, you, if you, once you recognize the source, maybe taking a step back and
Yeah. Know
just
your
like
triggers.
regulating that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's so important to know your triggers. Not all of us are going to have the same comparison triggers. For some
Mm,
people, it's going to be the amount of money they earn. For some people, it's going to be their body size. For some people, it's going to be a relationship or kids or the
yeah.
house, or it's going to be something as simple as their personality or
Mm,
their nose size or whatever, right? Like everyone's going to have very different triggers for comparison. And so it's really
yes.
important once you know your triggers, one, you can also like potentially try not to expose yourself to the same degree to those triggers, right? Like, um, as a way of like being like, you know what, it's really hard for me to say someone is struggling with like infertility or something, you know, maybe don't follow a bunch of mommy bloggers.
Yeah.
It may not be the season of your life to be looking at that, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
again, being really gentle with yourself of being like, wow, this is really hard for me. And I
Mm-hmm.
can choose to not keep putting myself in that level of hardship
Yep.
because I can't, it might be too hard to catch the comparison narrative. So we
Mm-hmm.
adjust the environment. Other times when it's something that you're like, okay, I just need to work on this comparison. It may not be something that you're like, oh, I'm not going to expose myself to this, but then it's going to be like recognizing like, okay, hey, I'm triggered. What are my signs that I'm triggered? And then what am I going to do to take care of myself when, you know, I do catch myself in comparison?
Mm, yeah, and that is helpful. And one of the other things, or one of the other things that I feel are challenging is to set healthy boundaries with people, to honor one's own mental health needs.
Yeah.
And how do we start to recognize the need for boundaries and respect them?
So some signs that you need to set boundaries would be if you are feeling resentful of people. Resentfulness usually to me can often indicate like boundaries not being respected or not having boundaries. Um, if you often find yourself um, doing things very begrudgingly or feeling a lot of anger towards having to do stuff, that's also maybe a sign to like tune into yourself. If you notice that in different spaces you function vastly differently, like you, that may be a sign that you aren't honoring your boundaries in the different spaces that you're in. And so again, just tuning inward to yourself and being like, am I comfortable with what I'm doing? Am I comfortable with what's being said to me? Am I feeling resentful of people? Am I feeling really angry having to do this or being around certain people? Are there spaces where I feel like saying no, but I don't say it, or I'm saying yes way too much? Right? Those are all going to be signs that some boundaries need to be set. The second piece of this is respecting boundaries. So oftentimes the conversation around boundaries is other people need to respect my boundaries. The reality is that you actually need to respect your own boundaries first, right?
Well,
we're waiting for
yeah.
other people to be like, okay, because you said not to do this, I'm not going to do this. That's great. Those are awesome relationships where you can say no to someone and the person's going to respect that no. But if you are saying no to something and the other person is still doing what they're doing, it is your job to respect your own boundary, to being like, hey, this keeps happening, so I'm going to do blank. Whether that's to step away from the relationship, whether that's to leave that physical space, whether that's to hang up the phone because something's being said that's not okay with you, right? Like, it is our job to know our boundaries and identify how we are going to make sure that we honor them.
Yeah.
Rather than waiting for other people to honor our boundaries. We can't, yes, it's part of healthy relationships where other people honor your boundaries. That's amazing when we have those relationships, but we may not always have that.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
say, for example, work is always taking over your life and you're like, I keep telling my boss or I keep telling my coworker not to call me after 6 p.m. or whatever, and they're not doing it. Part of your responsibility to yourself is figuring out, how do I honor my own boundary? What happens if I don't answer my phone after 5:30? Do I need to consider getting another job because my boundaries aren't being respected here? Right? Like, we have to take care of us.
You know, you said this, that is such a powerful thing. I think a lot of times we are so like, okay, you're so anxious about boundaries is because we think that it is, the concept is involves other people, but it's solely you. And you know, you respecting your own needs to a degree where you know that your sanity is intact.
Yes, right. Like, our boundaries are about us and living our values and keeping ourselves grounded and safe. We can't put that power in other people's hands.
No. Yeah.
So for example, like, just like I'm Pakistani, so like, you know, if you go to like weddings or whatever, like, aunties have comments to make, or they'll comment on your body size or whether or not you have children or why aren't you married or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of times those are spaces in which we may not even have time to like set the boundary. So
Mm,
it may be thinking about like, okay, if this auntie says this thing to me, what am I going to do for myself?
mm,
Can I exit the conversation? Can I change the topic? Can I just
mm,
say, auntie, that's really rude and walk away? Right? Like we
mm.
need to make sure that we have a game plan on how we're going to make sure we respect our boundaries.
Yeah.
Um, or it's going to be, I'm not even going to go say salam to that auntie because I know she's not going to have something nice to say to me. Right? Like
Mhm.
we have to know our boundaries and know that our boundaries are designed to take care of ourselves,
Mhm.
and we have to respect them.
Yeah, that is very powerful
And
and
very hard. So I
very
say all
hard.
of that, it's hard.
It is hard, and a lot of times it's like it's almost subconscious where I don't know if it's about a culture or something, but setting boundaries comes with a lot of guilt and and I guess a lot of like, oh, am I being a bad, bad? Am I being a bad daughter, a bad wife, or a bad mom, or am I being a
Yeah.
bad Muslim by
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
enforcing a certain boundary for to cater to my own mental health needs, to protect my mind, to protect my even my body, because as you said, there's definitely a connection between mental and physical health.
Yeah. I think we need to reframe what boundaries are. Boundaries are a essential healthy element of a
Mhm.
healthy relationship. You know
Yes.
how we talk about like, marriage, like you need to have healthy communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
In any relationship, you need to have healthy boundaries.
Yep.
There is no healthy relationship with no boundaries. It
Mm.
doesn't exist. And
Yep.
so, whether that is with marriage or your children or your parents or whoever else is in your life,
Mm-hmm.
do not have healthy boundaries, you do not have a healthy relationship. And
Yep.
so, to me, Islam highly emphasizes maintaining ties of family, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that is something that Islam values. Um, and obviously, maybe just putting abuse aside for a second, like
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about just like, normal relationships that have their ups and downs and some
Yep.
like behaviors that we're not okay with, part of our ability to maintain healthy ties
Mm-hmm.
is to have healthy boundaries.
That
We
is
cannot
powerful.
fulfill our Islamic duty of having family relationships if we don't also insert some boundaries.
Yes.
Because
And
eventually, sorry, so I just want to, because eventually what happens is
mm-hmm.
when a relationship exists with no boundaries, it makes us not want to be in that relationship anymore, right?
Yeah.
It makes us really resentful, really angry. It
Yeah.
creates distance because
Mm-hmm.
we never set any healthy boundaries in it.
Mm, yes. And that was like that was what I was going to say, and you just said it, mashallah. It's like we have that notion in our heads that setting this boundary is actually saving the relationship.
Yes, it
You
literally,
know?
yes, it is literally like, no, long-term relationships need healthy boundaries. That includes your
Mm,
parents, your in-laws, your siblings, your spouse, your children.
yep.
They're essential.
Yeah, and as you said, you don't if we don't set it, and it's gonna lead to unhealthy behaviors and resentment, and it just builds up and it's explodes at one point, and there are so many consequences of not setting a boundary,
So
and
many.
so many. And as you said, setting a boundary is actually helpful in saving that relationship and helps you fulfill your duties
Yeah.
and actually feeling good about uh, fulfilling them.
Yes, you can do them with a good
Yeah.
intention, with
Mm-hmm.
good emotion. The other thing I think sometimes we think about boundaries is boundaries are not rigid.
Yeah.
Boundaries can evolve, boundaries change as you change, as the people around you change. They can become more flexible, they can become more like rigid. Like
Mm-hmm.
boundaries will evolve as things evolve. So sometimes we think that like if we're going to set boundaries, they have to look the same all the time. They actually
Mm-hmm.
don't, right? Like
Yeah.
boundaries will change as things change. You're allowed to change your boundaries based off of where you're at and how you're feeling. Maybe like say you're somebody who struggles with depression, your
Mm-hmm.
boundaries while you're depressed may look different than when you're okay because your context is different.
Yes. Yep.
Your boundaries when you are single versus when you're married may look different. Your
Mm-hmm.
boundaries, like they evolve as you evolve and as your life evolves and as your context evolves.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not these rigid things that you need to set. They're just things that you need to be paying attention to and taking your values and your context into consideration as you set them.
Mm. And that is a beautiful point, knowing that these are not like fixed entities. They're flexible, they're rigid, they change, and you just have to pay attention to them. Most likely not essentially have like a physical like manifestation of like a actual boundary being drawn, but just like, okay, this is okay and this is not, and I'm gonna do my best to enforce this principle.
Yeah. And so again, this is about you and, you living your values and taking your capacity and context into consideration. And it evolves. It's constantly changing. And that's healthy, right? We evolve and we change, and our dynamics change as we change.
Yes. And thank you so much for like highlighting those points. They're very important. I hope our listeners benefit from that. And speaking of our listeners, so how can our listeners get involved with your mental health service and the work you do?
So when you can follow me on Instagram, I run an account called Growth Work. I'm also, inshallah, the plan for the new year is to offer more online workshops and things that I can provide to people who don't live where I provide therapy. I get a lot of requests for therapy. I'm very limited in who I can provide therapy to, because therapists are limited by where they're licensed, and I'm currently only licensed in the state of Virginia. And so if you live in Virginia, you can reach out to me for therapy. But if you do not live in Virginia, I'm going to be, inshallah, offering a lot more online like workshops and classes, so that we can all build these emotional skills together, which I really love to do.
That is awesome, inshallah. And thank you so much, Sumayyah, for being on the podcast. I totally appreciate your time and totally enjoyed this conversation. And I hope I can get you here again.
Inshallah. Thank you for doing the work that you do. And again, I think conversations like these are changing how we approach mental health in our community. And it's really exciting to see. So thank you for wanting to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Please subscribe to Impact Club Podcast and follow Sumayyah. And thank you so much. And I will see you next time.